I wanted to do a little pre-lesson on the max and min because it's changed a little bit. So let's go over a quadratic. If I gave you a quadratic and I had you graph it, you could see here there is no max, but the minimum would be the vertex, which you could actually find. So you wouldn't need a calculator for that. But here's the deal. Now we're dealing with higher polynomials. So let's say you had an x cubed. If I was to rough sketch an x cubed, and let's say the zeros were -3, 7, and 2. So I go -3, 2, and 7. I put my little zeros, and I do that, okay? And let's say my y-intercept was at 8, okay? If I'm going to graph this thing, well, if it's cubic, so it's like a line, which means it starts from the bottom. Well, remember, I'm just rough sketching it. If I'm rough sketching it, I'm just drawing whatever I think, and I can't use the calculator to help me figure out those exact values where it changes. So I'm going to kind of have to play with it a little bit. I do know that technically, if I'm dealing with the max and the min, there is no max because it goes up and up forever. And there is no min because it goes down and down forever. But there's something called the relative max and the relative min. And what it means is that, relatively speaking, besides the not going forever, what is the top point? So here's the deal. However you graph it, match it. It doesn't matter. Which means if you decide to draw it like this, that would be your max. So just depending on how you draw it, I can make it look more like that, look a little bit better. Okay? So I decided to do it here at 0, 8. Now here, I'm just making it up. So as long as that x value is between 2 and 7, I'm happy. It doesn't have to be in the middle, whatever. I could just make it a 3, or I could make it a 6, or I can make it a 4.5. And the y value has to be negative, so let's say -10. So if that's what you put, then that's what will match. So when you're doing your intervals, if you remember doing your intervals, we would always focus on the x values. As long as it matches your max and min, I'm a happy girl. Which also means if you decided to make this your graph, and you had this was -3, that x value just has to be between 0 and -3, so let's say -1. And then if the y-intercept was here at 0, 8, it just needs to be a y value bigger than 8. So let's say 12. And then if this was my 2 and this was my 7, I can still make the x value 3, but maybe I only wanted it at -2. So then if I was doing my intervals at -infinity and positive infinity, this now is the intervals that I'm using. Okay? Let me do one more example of that to show you what I mean. Let's say I had a -x to the 4th. So if I have a -x to the 4th, and let's say my zeros are 3, -1, and I'm going to write multiplicity 2, which means there's 2 of them, which means you're going to have a bounce, okay? And so that gives me 2 of them, and then let's say the other one is 5, okay? Let's say it's square root of 5, whatever. So if I'm going to rough sketch this, and I'm going to say there's rad 5, 3, and -1 with a bounce. Okay, and I'm just going to show that's my bounce. And then I'm going to say my y-intercept. Here, let me do this. Let's say my y-intercept is 16. Okay, remember, I'm just faking it. I've just got to make sure that I follow, oops, it's not going to work then. It can't be 16. It would have to be -16. Let's make it -16. I just have to make sure I follow the rules. Okay. So remember, I just made this up so I could show you an example of max and min. If you look at x to the 4th, it's like a u. Well, a u starts from the top, but the problem is it's negative, so it starts from the bottom. So I'm going to start down here. Now, once I'm at -1, if you look, I had multiplicity 2. That means there's 2 of them. I'm bouncing. Okay? And then I got to hit the rad 5, and then I got to go down to 3. This is my rough sketch. It's not necessarily the only sketch, but it's my rough sketch. This is negative infinity, okay? Oops, I'm sorry, positive infinity, okay? So if I'm going to do my max and my min, technically there is no minimum, but there's a relative minimum. Relatively speaking, I made that my minimum. Now for the max, there is a max. It's this. It's not even relatively speaking. This is the max. So if I have rad 5, well, the square root of 5, let's say you're like, I don't know what it is. Then just know that it's less than 2. So make the x value 2. And then I just have to make sure it's a positive value. So let's say 6. Therefore, my max is at 2, 6. And then if I was to make this value here negative 1, 0, because that is the case, when I'm doing my intervals, it increases from negative infinity to negative 1. It decreases from negative 1 to 0. It increases from 0 to 2, and it decreases from 0 to positive infinity. Just want to make sure you understand those things. So pretty much what I've highlighted is the max and the min, how you're making sense of it logically, okay, and the bounce of multiplicity 2, and how you can work with those intervals.